I've always been the kind of guy who doesn't believe in anything he can't see with his own eyes. You know, that tough trucker who hears all the ghost stories at rest stops, but just laughs them off and keeps moving? That was me. Or at least it used to be. My name's Bill Henderson, and I've been on the road for over 20 years. I've driven routes across the entire country, from coast to coast, and I can tell you, I've seen it all. Heavy rain that feels like it's going to push the truck off the road, sandstorms in the desert, deer jumping out of nowhere. None of it ever really fazed me. The job's simple. Pick up the load, follow the GPS, and deliver it on time. No mistake. But on that trip, on that damn route through the middle of Texas, everything changed. It started out like any other day. I got up early, had my black coffee, checked the route on my GPS, and hopped into my old rig. The sun was just coming up, and the road ahead looked perfect. Straight, clean, hardly any traffic. I've driven down deserted highways before, so I didn't think twice when I saw that the route I needed to take was one of those back roads through nowhere. Texas is full of them, and we know that the shortest routes sometimes go through these isolated places but save you a good amount of time. What I didn't know was that this road was different. It was a route the GPS barely even seemed to recognize, almost like it didn't exist. But in the rush to make the delivery on time, I decided to go for it. The asphalt started to get rougher as I drove, but the scenery around me was actually kind of nice in a lonely way. The radio was playing some random country song, and I was tapping my foot to the beat, feeling relaxed. The sky was clear, not a cloud in sight, and the only company I had was the sound of the engine and the road under the tires. So far, everything seemed normal, but deep down I started to get this weird feeling. You know when you walk into a place and you can just tell something's off, but you can't put your finger on it? That's what it felt like. In the silence, it started to weigh on me. I didn't notice it at first, but with every mile I drove, it felt like the world around me was slowly fading away. The signs, the few cars that passed by, the rest stops, all of it just disappeared. It was like the road was purposely isolating me, taking me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. Then all of a sudden the GPS froze. I looked down and it was just blank. No route, no waypoints. It was like I was driving into nothing. At first, I didn't worry. These things lose signal all the time in remote areas. I convinced myself it had come back soon. Then I saw the first sign. It was an old, rusted warning sign, the letters almost faded. Road closed. Proceed with caution. Closed road? The road ahead was wide open, clear as any other. Just an old sign, right? I forced myself to ignore it. But the shiver I felt when I drove past was impossible to shake. Something deep inside me, a voice I tried to push down, told me to turn around. But who am I to listen to a gut feeling? I kept going. After all, I'm a skeptic, remember? And that's how it all started. With me, stubborn and full of confidence, driving deeper into a road that, by the looks of it, didn't even exist on the maps. A road that would soon make me question everything I believed in. The miles kept ticking by, but something about the road ahead didn't feel right. I mean, at first, it was nothing out of the ordinary. Just an empty highway cutting through the Texas desert, surrounded by nothing but endless stretches of sand, scrub bushes, and the occasional tumbleweed. But the more I drove, the more I noticed how empty it really was. No cars, not a single one. Now, I've driven lonely highways before, but even then, you'll pass someone eventually, another trucker, a family on a road trip, something. But out here, it was like I was the only soul for miles. The longer I went, the deeper that feeling crept in. It wasn't just loneliness, though. It felt like I was driving into, I don't know, a place I wasn't supposed to be. I remember glancing at the clock on the dashboard. I'd been driving for hours, but it didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. No rest stops, no gas stations, not even a damn roadside diner. Just mile after mile of cracked pavement stretching into the horizon. The sun, which had been bright in the sky when I started, was now hanging low, casting these long, eerie shadows across the road. It was that time of day when the light gets weird, right before dusk settles in. The kind of light that makes everything look strange, like you're seeing the world through some sort of distorted lens. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been on that road far too long. Then my GPS completely died. 1 second it was glitching, trying to reroute me, and the next the screen just went black. No signal, no map, nothing. I tapped it a few times, hoping it was just a hiccup, but it stayed dead. I reached over and fiddled with the power cord, thinking maybe it had come loose, but everything was plugged in tight. Great, I muttered to myself. Just what I need. I pulled over to the side of the road, put the truck in park, and leaned back in my seat. The silence hit me harder than I expected. Normally, there's always some background noise, wind rustling through the trees, distant hum of traffic, something. But here, nothing. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady, but getting louder, like the silence was pressing in on me. I opened the window, hoping maybe I'd catch a breeze or hear something. Anything that would remind me I wasn't completely alone out there. Instead, I was greeted by this overwhelming stillness. It felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. I scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of life. Another car, an animal. Hell, even a bird would have been a welcome sight. But there was nothing, just that never-ending road and the fading light. I considered turning around, heading back the way I came. But something kept me going forward, maybe stubbornness or just that trucker instinct that says, if you keep moving, you'll figure it out. So I did. I put the truck back in gear and rolled back onto the highway. That's when I saw it, a sign. It came out of nowhere, standing crooked on the side of the road like it had been there forever, but was barely hanging on. The metal was rusted and weathered, and the writing was faded, but I could still make it out. Danger ahead, road closed. I slowed down, squinting to see if I could spot any barricades or construction up ahead. But the road looked clear, just as empty and lonely as it had been for miles. The asphalt wasn't in the best shape, with cracks running through it, but I'd seen worse. Nothing to suggest it was dangerous enough to shut the whole thing down. I figured it was just some old, outdated sign that no one had bothered to take down. Still, there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but everything about that sign rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the fact that the GPS had already died, or maybe it was the silence that had settled over the place. But I couldn't shake the sense that I was being warned about something. Something I couldn't see yet. But I wasn't about to let a rusty, old sign stop me. So I kept driving, telling myself it was just a detour, maybe an old route that people didn't use much anymore. I'd push through, get back to the main road eventually, and this would all be behind me. That's what I thought. But as the sun dipped lower, casting the road in this eerie twilight, that feeling of being watched crept up on me again. I checked my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights coming up behind me, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of empty road and the growing darkness. And for the first time in a long time, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I'd made a mistake. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, darkness settled over the road like a thick blanket. The temperature dropped fast, and with it came this bone-deep chill that didn't make any sense. It was Texas, the desert. Even at night, it should have been warm, but I felt like the air around me had turned icy. I reached over and cranked up the heat in the truck, but it didn't do much to shake that cold creeping up my spine. Something felt off, way off. I kept driving, trying to shake the growing sense of unease, but every mile felt longer than the last. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching on and on with no end in sight. Worse, I couldn't remember the last time I'd passed anything resembling civilization. No gas stations, no rest stops, no houses, just the empty highway swallowed by the desert. Suddenly, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something up ahead. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, just a figure standing by the side of the road. As I got closer, though it looked wrong, the shape was too still, too stiff, like it wasn't actually a person. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my pulse quickening as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. But as the truck approached, the figure vanished into the shadows, almost like it had been swallowed by the darkness itself. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to see if someone was out there. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, the way the headlights cut through the desert at night. Or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me after all those hours on the road. But deep down, I knew what I saw, or at least what I thought I saw. And it wasn't just a shadow. I told myself to keep moving. Whatever it wasn't my problem. I'd been on the road long enough to know better than to stop in the middle of nowhere. especially when something didn't feel right. So I pressed down on the gas, pushing the truck forward, hoping that the faster I drove, the faster I'd outrun the weirdness settling around me. But as the night deepened, the sense that I wasn't alone grew stronger. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights in the distance, or maybe the shadowy figure I'd passed earlier. But all I saw was pitch black emptiness. Still, that feeling wouldn't leave me, like there was something out there just beyond the edges of my vision, watching, waiting. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a faint glow up ahead. It was off to the side of the road, flickering dimly in the darkness. At first, I thought it might be the lights of a distant town. Finally, a sign of life after all those hours of nothing. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a town at all. It was an old, rundown gas station, the kind that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The neon sign out front was barely legible, flickering weakly in the night. It spelled out something, but most of the letters were burnt out. All I could make out was station. I slowed down again, eyeing the building. The windows were broken, and the door hung open, creaking slightly in the wind. There was an old rusted car parked off to the side, covered in dust, like it hadn't moved in decades. My instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something about that place pulled me in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the thought of finding someone else. Anyone to talk to. Hell, maybe it was just the hope that my phone might pick up a signal if I stopped for a minute. I pulled the truck into the lot and parked. The engine rumbled to a stop, and for a moment, everything went silent again. That eerie, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the whole place. I reached for my phone, hoping to check my GPS, but still no service. No surprise there. I stepped out of the truck, and the cold hit me again, sharper this time, like the air had been sucked out of the night. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the gas station, my breath visible in the air, even though it shouldn't have been that cold. The closer I got, the worse the place looked. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the roof sagged in the middle. I could see the remains of an old vending machine through the broken window, long emptied out. I don't know what I expected to find, but standing there in front of that building, I realized just how wrong everything felt. The whole place was off, like it was stuck in time, abandoned and forgotten, yet somehow still there, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Something deep in my gut told me not to go inside. Every fiber of my being screamed to get back in the truck and drive. But as I stood there, frozen in place, I heard something faint, barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was so soft I almost didn't catch it. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, a distant, echoing voice from inside the station, calling out. The whispering voice sent a jolt through me, freezing me in place. I strained to hear it again, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, it was just a faint murmur, like the wind playing tricks, but as I stood there, gripping the cold metal of the door handle, it grew clearer. Someone or something was inside that gas station. Help, please! The words were barely audible, like they were being carried from a long distance, but I knew I heard them. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, inside an abandoned gas station? I took a step back, my instincts telling me to leave, but curiosity and a sense of duty stopped me. I've heard my fair share of stories about people breaking down on desolate roads and getting stranded, but they never end well. Still, if someone was in trouble, I couldn't just drive off and leave them. That's not the kind of man I am. I pushed the door open with a creak, and it swung inward, revealing the interior of the gas station. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and mildew, like the place hadn't seen a living soul in years. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, pieces of wood, scraps of paper, and the shelves were bare, their contents long gone. The faint flicker of light from the neon sign outside cast strange shadows on the walls, stretching and twisting as if the darkness itself was alive. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the emptiness. It echoed back at me, but no response came. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the debris as I moved deeper into the station. The temperature dropped even more, the cold sinking into my bones, making me shiver. My breath puffed out in front of me, each exhale hanging in the frigid air longer than it should have. "Is anyone here?" I called out again, this time louder. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then from the back of the building, I heard it again, soft, almost pleading. "Help me!" The voice was clearer now, unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. It sounded close, but also distant, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the walls. I scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source, but all I saw were shadows. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my senses screaming that something was wrong, that I needed to get out. But the voice, it was so human, so desperate. I couldn't ignore it. I moved toward the back of the station, where a small hallway led to what looked like an old office or storage room. The door at the end of the hall was ajar, and that's where the voice was coming from. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, like the air around me was thickening, pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. My palms were slick with sweat, and I wiped them on my jeans, trying to steady myself. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. The voice had stopped again, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast in my ears. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open with a creak. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The flickering light from the gas station sign barely reached here, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. In the middle of the room, I saw an old beat-up chair sitting right in the center, and strapped to it was a jacket. Not just any jacket, though, a high-visibility orange vest with reflective strips. The kind truckers wear. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one in the room, just that chair, sitting under a flickering light bulb, with the vest hanging limply over the back. It didn't make any sense. Where was the person calling for help? The voice had been so clear, so close. I stepped further into the room, feeling like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. The chill in the air deepened, and that creeping sensation of being watched washed over me again. I walked up to the chair, my breath catching in my throat as I reached for the vest. It looked worn, stained with dirt and something else, something darker. As my fingers brushed against it, I froze. The air in the room shifted. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like the atmosphere itself had changed, like I wasn't alone anymore. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of there, but I was rooted in place. And then, from behind me, I heard it again. "Help me!" But this time, the voice wasn't distant. It wasn't faint. It was right there, right behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. But there was nothing, just that damn empty chair, sitting under the flickering light, mocking me. The voice was gone, replaced by the deafening silence. My skin prickled with fear, my legs shaky as I backed out of the room. I didn't stop until I was outside again, slamming the door to the gas station behind me. My truck loomed in the distance, the only familiar thing in this strange, hostile landscape. I bolted back to it, my breath ragged, the cold air biting at my face. As I climbed inside and locked the doors, I glanced back at the gas station one last time. The sign flickered weakly in the night, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving inside. Just a shadow, shifting behind the broken windows. I slammed the truck door behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. What the hell had just happened in there? The cold that clung to me from inside that gas station still hadn't let go, even as I sat in the cab, trying to catch my breath. My fingers finally found the ignition, and with a twist, the engine roared to life. The familiar sound should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Not tonight. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, casting long beams over the desolate landscape. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone emerging from the gas station, but the only thing behind me was the flickering neon sign. The broken windows of the building stared back at me like dark, hollow eyes, as if the place itself was watching, waiting for me to come back. But I wasn't going back. Not for anything. I threw the truck into gear, the tires crunching over the gravel as I pulled out of the lot. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles had turned white. I needed to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. The road stretched out ahead of me, disappearing into the night. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I kept glancing in the mirrors, my eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless, empty highway behind me. I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Maybe the long hours of driving had gotten to me, and I was starting to hallucinate. That would explain the voice, the shadows, the strange feeling in the air. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. I knew what I heard, and it wasn't in my head. There was someone or something inside that gas station, and it was calling for me. As the miles rolled by, I reached for my phone again, hoping that by now, I'd be able to get a signal. Nothing. The screen was blank, no bars, no GPS, no way of contacting anyone. I tossed it onto the passenger seat, frustrated, my nerves still frayed. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only living person for miles. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional thump as the tires hit a crack in the asphalt. I told myself to focus on the drive, to keep going and not look back, but that growing sense of unease was gnawing at me. It was then, as I was staring out into the darkness, that I saw them. Just for a split second, but long enough for my stomach to drop. Figures. Dark, shadowy figures standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was the same thing I'd seen earlier, just a trick of the light, but as I passed, they didn't vanish. They stood there, tall and unmoving, like silent sentinels watching me pass by. My breath caught in my throat, and my foot instinctively pressed harder on the gas. The truck surged forward, but the faster I drove, the more I saw them. One after another, scattered along the roadside, just standing there, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. Each one seemed to get closer to the road, as if they were inching their way toward the truck, trying to catch my attention. I gripped the wheel, my pulse racing, trying to focus on the road ahead and not the figures appearing in my peripheral vision. They weren't real. They couldn't be. This was just my mind playing tricks on me, I kept telling myself. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of that, the cold sweat on the back of my neck told me otherwise. I glanced in the side mirror, hoping to prove that it was all in my head, but as soon as I did, I regretted it. In the reflection, standing just behind the truck, so close I could almost see its face, was one of them. A tall, dark figure, its outline barely visible in the glow of the taillights. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, following me. My chest tightened with panic, and I snapped my eyes back to the road, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't dare look back again. The truck roared down the highway, the engine growling as I pushed it faster, trying to outrun whatever it was that was tailing me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the horizon swallowed by the night. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, my knuckles still clenched tight around the wheel. I just had to keep going, just had to get out of this godforsaken place. And then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the figures were gone. The road was empty again, the shadows retreating into the night. I slowed down, not daring to stop, but easing off the gas just enough to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with everything I'd just seen. I was half tempted to pull over and take a moment to calm down, but I knew better. I had to keep moving. Stopping wasn't an option. But even as the road stretched out in front of me, something still didn't feel right. I glanced at the dashboard, at the fuel gauge, and my stomach dropped. The needle was dangerously close to empty, much lower than it had been when I'd left the gas station. It didn't make any sense. I hadn't driven far enough to burn through that much fuel, but the gauge didn't lie. I needed to find a place to stop, soon, or I was going to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. I scanned the horizon, hoping to spot a gas station, a rest stop, anything, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway and the oppressive darkness closing in around me. I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, but the dread that had settled deep in my gut wasn't letting up. The needle on the fuel gauge inched closer to empty with each passing mile, and every minute that went by felt like a countdown to something inevitable. My heart was racing, the thrum of the engine doing nothing to drown out the persistent unease crawling up my spine. The figures were gone, but the memory of them, those dark, shadowy shapes lining the roadside, stuck with me. What were they? Who were they? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts. There was no time for that right now. I needed to focus. There had to be something ahead, some kind of pit stop where I could refuel. But as the road stretched out before me, it became painfully clear that I wasn't anywhere near civilization. The landscape was barren, the stars above doing little to pierce the thick, oppressive darkness that surrounded me. It was like I had driven into another world, one where time and space didn't make sense. The road signs were no help either. Every time I thought I saw one, it would disappear just as quickly as it appeared, like the night itself was swallowing it up. And the GPS? Still useless, showing nothing but a blank screen, as if the system had given up on me entirely. I was flying blind, and the truck's fuel gauge wasn't giving me much time to figure things out. The air inside the cab felt heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to crack the window to let in some fresh air, but the second I did, the cold outside hit me like a slap in the face. It wasn't normal cold, it was bone-chilling, like it had seeped straight from the grave. I slammed the window shut and rubbed my hands together, trying to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. A flicker of light in the distance caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, the shape of a building began to emerge from the darkness. My heart leaped with cautious hope. A gas station. I squinted, trying to make out the details through the gloom. It wasn't well lit, just a few flickering lights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement, but it was better than nothing. The sign hanging above the pumps was so weathered that I couldn't make out the name of the place, but at this point I didn't care. Relief flooded through me as I pulled in, the truck sputtering slightly as I let off the gas. The place was run down, the pumps old and rusted, but they looked functional. That's all I needed. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cold, the air biting in my face as I fumbled to unscrew the gas cap. My breath fogged in front of me as I glanced around. The station looked deserted, but not in the way the last one had. This wasn't abandoned, it was just forgotten. Like people had come here once, long ago, but then they stopped, for reasons I didn't want to think too hard about. I grabbed the nozzle and started pumping, the sound of gas filling the tank a welcome reprieve from the eerie silence that hung in the air. As I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. I turned, scanning the area, but there was nothing, just the dim lights and the shadows they cast across the cracked pavement. But then I saw it, movement, just beyond the edge of the light, in the darkness where the road disappeared into the night. A figure standing still, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, the gas pump still in my hand. It was one of them, just like the others I'd seen on the road. But this one was closer, too close. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but it was like the figure was cloaked in shadow, barely more than a dark outline against the night. It didn't move, didn't come any closer, just stood there staring. I couldn't see a face, but I knew it was looking right at me. My skin prickled with fear, my instincts screaming at me to get back in the truck and leave. But I didn't. Not yet. I kept my eyes on the figure, the pump still filling the tank, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering bulbs. But deep down, I knew better. My breath came in shallow gasps, my fingers trembling as I gripped the nozzle tighter, trying to stay calm. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I yanked the nozzle out and shoved it back into the holder, my hands shaking as I screwed the gas cap back on. I moved fast, not daring to look away from the figure for more than a second. When I finally slid back into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure right behind me. But it wasn't there. I let out a shaky breath, the cold air inside the cab doing little to soothe my nerves. I started the engine, the familiar roar comforting in a way it hadn't been before. I was ready to get the hell out of there. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I pulled away from the gas station, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The figure was still there, standing on the edge of the light, watching me drive away. But this time, there was more than one. There were several of them, just like the ones I'd seen on the road earlier. They were all standing there, lined up along the roadside, motionless, their dark silhouettes blending into the night. My stomach twisted with fear as I pressed harder on the gas, my truck roaring down the empty highway. The figures grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until they were swallowed by the darkness entirely. But the fear lingered, gnawing at me, telling me that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I kept driving, but my hands were trembling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The darkness outside the truck felt suffocating, pressing in on all sides as if the night itself was alive. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart racing faster than the truck's engine. I hadn't been on edge like this in years, but something about this stretch of highway was different, unnatural. As the miles rolled by, my mind replayed the last few hours over and over. The voices on the radio, the strange figures along the road, the feeling of being watched at the gas station. It didn't make any sense. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, that I was seeing things, that this couldn't be real. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the fear gnawing at me wouldn't go away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures standing on the road behind me, their dark, featureless forms chasing me down. But the highway behind was empty, just a long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the black void of the night. I tried to take a deep breath, tried to steady my nerves, but the chill that had settled deep in my bones wouldn't go away. It felt like something was still there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. The fuel gauge had crept back toward empty again, much faster than it should have. I had just filled up, but it didn't matter. The needle was dropping at an alarming rate, like the truck was burning through gas faster than it ever had before. That shouldn't have been possible, but nothing about this night was making sense anymore. I didn't want to think about what might happen if I ran out of gas out here, in the middle of nowhere, with whatever those things were lurking just beyond the headlights. I scanned the horizon for any sign of life, a rest stop, a diner, anything, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out endlessly ahead of me. The isolation weighed on me, the silence inside the cab growing heavier with every passing mile. Even the radio, which had been my constant companion for most of my trips, had gone silent. I turned it off after that voice came through, but now I was almost desperate to hear something, anything, other than the haunting quiet that surrounded me. But the fear of hearing that voice again kept me from turning it back on. The darkness outside the truck had taken on a life of its own, the headlights barely cutting through the thick night. The road seemed to twist and turn in ways it shouldn't, like it was leading me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. I kept my eyes on the lines painted on the asphalt, but even they seemed to waver in the distance, bending in ways that made my head spin. A sudden flash of movement caught my eye. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt, my heart leaping into my throat. Something had darted across the road, right in front of me, too fast for me to make out what it was, but big enough that I'd seen it. I sat there, frozen, my foot still on the brake, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stared into the darkness ahead, the beams of the headlights stretching out as far as they could, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just the oppressive silence of the night. For a moment, I considered the possibility that it had been a deer or some other animal. But I knew better. This stretch of road didn't feel like the kind of place where normal things happened. My gut told me that whatever I'd seen wasn't something natural. I was about to hit the gas and keep driving when the truck's engine sputtered. The sound was like a punch to the gut, my heart skipping a beat. The fuel gauge had dropped below empty, even though it shouldn't have been anywhere near that. The engine sputtered again, and my stomach twisted with dread. I couldn't break down here. Not now. I pressed the gas pedal, trying to pull the truck forward, but the engine struggled, coughing and groaning as if something was choking the life out of it. The lights flickered, dimming for a split second before coming back on. My hands were slick with sweat as I tried again, praying the truck would keep moving. Then the engine died. The truck rolled to a stop, and the silence that followed was deafening. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold seeping in through the vents despite everything being shut tight. I looked down at the dashboard, hoping for some kind of miracle, but the lights were out, the needles on the gauges stuck at 0. I was stranded. I glanced out the windows, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The road ahead was empty, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon peeking through the clouds. I reached for my phone, praying for a signal, but when I pressed the screen, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I cursed under my breath, the panic starting to set in. I was miles away from anywhere, trapped in the middle of nowhere with no way to contact anyone. And worst of all, I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The presence, the same one I'd felt since I first saw those figures on the side of the road. It was stronger now, closer. My pulse quickened as I stared into the night, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. I had no choice. I had to get out of the truck. Sitting here wasn't an option. But the thought of stepping out into that darkness, with those things lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights, made my skin crawl. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the door handle, trying to summon the courage to move. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, carried on the wind like a whisper meant just for me. "Bill!" My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone my name. The voice was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo through the silence, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. "Bill!" The sound sent a jolt of ice through my veins, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't told anyone my name, especially not in this forsaken stretch of highway. The realization that someone or something knew who I was, that it was calling me by name, made my skin prickle with terror. I froze, the truck's interior a haven of relative safety, but even inside, I felt exposed, vulnerable. The darkness outside seemed to press closer, and the shadows outside the window began to take on a more ominous shape. The voice had come from somewhere off in the distance, but I couldn't pinpoint its origin. It was like the wind carried it from all directions at once. My instinct screamed at me to stay inside, but the truck's dying engine and dead phone left me with no other options. I had to figure out a way out of this nightmare. I hesitated, my hands still hovering over the door handle. Every ounce of my being screamed to stay put, but the thought of being stranded here, vulnerable to whatever was lurking in the dark, was unbearable. I took a deep breath and forced myself to open the door, the creaking of the hinges louder than I expected. The cold night air hit me like a wall, icy and oppressive. I stepped out of the truck, my feet crunching on the gravel, and immediately felt the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and the distant, echoing voice that seemed to grow louder the further I went. I turned back to glance at the truck, but the headlights were already dimming, the truck sitting there like an abandoned relic in the vast, empty void. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled a few times as I made my way toward the source of the sound. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the ground, twisting and distorting with every movement. The road stretched out ahead, but the shadows seemed to reach out, grabbing at me as I moved. I could hear the voice again, closer now, but still just a murmur on the wind. I tried to follow it, but the darkness made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I kept moving, each step feeling heavier than the last, the air growing colder with each passing second. The trees on either side of the road seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I pushed forward, the fear gnawing at me, urging me to turn back. The voice was louder now, almost a pleading whisper, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if whatever was calling me was trapped, desperate for someone to come closer. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. What if it was trying to lure me into a trap? What if it was something far worse than just shadows and whispers? I kept walking, my senses on high alert, trying to follow the sound. Then, suddenly the voice stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I froze, straining to hear any hint of what might come next. My eyes scanned the darkness, but there was nothing, No movement, no sound. Just the oppressive quiet of the night. A chill ran down my spine as I turned around, starting to head back toward the truck. The darkness seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing deeper, more threatening. I could feel the cold wrapping around me, seeping through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. I quickened my pace, stumbling over the uneven ground as I made my way back. Just as I reached the truck, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but the darkness was impenetrable. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a surge of panic. I scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut behind me. I turned the key in the ignition, praying for the engine to start, but the truck only sputtered, the lights flickering in and out. The growl came again, closer this time, and I could almost feel the presence pressing in on me, its malevolence palpable. My hands shook as I tried to start the truck again, the engine turning over but refusing to catch. I glanced around, the shadows outside the windows twisting and writhing like dark, sentient beings. The growl turned into a series of disjointed whispers, voices layered on top of each other, calling out my name in a chilling chorus. My head was spinning, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I fought to control my panic. The truck's engine sputtered one last time before dying completely, plunging me into darkness. I was trapped. I could feel it closing in on me, the presence outside growing stronger, more oppressive. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. I tried to brace myself, to accept whatever was coming, but the fear was overwhelming, making it hard to think straight. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I sat in the darkness, my heart racing, my body trembling uncontrollably. I felt as if the very fabric of reality had shifted, leaving me in a void where nothing made sense. The cold was unbearable, and I could feel it seeping into every part of me. Then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the truck's engine roared back to life. The headlights flickered on, casting their beams over the road ahead, but the figures and shadows were gone. The gas gauge still read empty, but the truck was moving, the engine running smoothly. It was as if the nightmare had never happened. I drove on, the fear still clinging to me, but the road was clear, the darkness retreating as I put more miles between myself and that cursed stretch of highway. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a lit gas station and refueled. The normalcy of the place was almost a shock, and I took a moment to compose myself before heading inside. The memories of that night would haunt me for a long time. The darkness, the whispers, the growl. I couldn't explain any of it. All I knew was that the road I had taken was no ordinary stretch of highway. It was a place where shadows had a life of their own, where voices called out from beyond the grave. And as I drove away from that cursed road, I made a promise to myself. Never again would I venture down an unknown path without a second thought.